When you take on the task of reviewing every game ever commercially released in the English language for the Genesis/Mega Drive, what you find out pretty quickly is that the stereotype is true that there were lots of sports games released for the console. There's not so many that I feel like it hurts the library in general, but there is a lot, and it's an interesting transition from the Master System library, which was comparatively more balanced, unless you're talking about soccer. Due to the Genesis owning that space with the best sports games of the era, or best versions of those games, there were lots of companies that wanted in on the action, which resulted in many smaller, lesser-known sports games being released. For every college football's national championship from Sega, there's a NCAA football from Mindscape. For every IMG International Tour tennis from EA, there's David Crane's Amazing Tennis from Absolute. And for every Pele from Accolade, there's a Pele II? However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are rolling your eyes at the idea of me reviewing a C-tier sports game sequel from 1994, if you haven't clicked out of the video already. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I've got to say, yes, your time probably would be better spent watching 20 minutes of Pele highlights from actual games. But then you'd miss out on seeing me miserable for 20 minutes. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. So, Pele II, or more specifically, Pele II World Tournament Soccer, if you read that fine print. Previously on the channel in episode 182, I reviewed the original Pele, and despite the fact that it's got a pretty terrible reputation as a soccer game, I actually didn't completely hate it, at least not after I finally figured out how to score. Because of that, I ended up giving it 2 stars. Essentially, while I didn't dislike it as much as a lot of other people, I still thought it had lots of room for improvement, especially when compared to its contemporaries, FIFA International Soccer and Sensible Soccer. This is where Pele II comes in, theoretically speaking anyway. Released 6 months after the original Pele, Pele II hit the market in June of 1994. You might be thinking to yourself that 6 months between editions of a sports title is an unusually short amount of time. And you'd be right, as normally iterations in sports game series come out once per year to correspond with new seasons of the various sports. In the case of Pele II, though, this is where that subtitle becomes important. It refers to itself as World Tournament Soccer because of a certain 1994 World Cup that just happened to be starting that same month. But of course they couldn't call it Pele II World Cup Soccer due to EA having the FIFA license. So is Pele II simply a quick cash grab on Accolade's part and just barely an updated version of the game with national teams instead of the club teams that were in the original Pele? Or did Accolade and Radical Entertainment make the most of these 6 months between releases and really work to create a much improved game? Well, we shall see, but first, a look at the package. And here's my copy of Pele II for the Genesis. This brings up a bit of a cautionary tale when it comes to collecting, and not necessarily Pele II, but just collecting in general. Due to this not being one of the more impressive sports series on the console, it's also not the most common to run across complete. When I finally picked up a copy of it a few years back, I didn't pay very close attention to the condition of the game because I was just happy to finally come across a complete copy of it. And I actually still remember where I picked it up too, the Naperville disc replay. Anyway, when I got it home, I realized that there was something goofy about it because the manual didn't fit properly. Well, it turns out that since both Electronic Arts and Accolade cartridges have similar sizes, what someone had done was they took an extra EA box that they had and stuck all the Pele II stuff inside it, which is why the manual didn't fit correctly. Because the manual was so hard to find at the time, I ended up ordering another copy off of eBay that was missing the manual to put together a proper copy of the game. But the reason why I said this is a cautionary tale isn't just because I wasn't paying attention when I bought it originally, it's also that sometimes you can just be unlucky when it comes to not finding things. Looking for the game this week on eBay, I found at least 3 complete copies, all relatively inexpensive. So when I was having trouble finding it before, I just wasn't patient enough, and had I waited longer, I probably could have found a better looking copy without going through all of that trouble. Even though currently complete copies will probably run you from $15 to $20, here's some listings from price charting back from when I was looking for it, so you can see what I mean about how, for a time anyway, it was harder and more expensive to come across. After all that, this is what you're left with, a copy of Pele II that's clearly seen better days. But I'm definitely not going through the trouble of trying to get another copy of it. The outer case is actually in decent shape, but unfortunately the inner cover shows some definite signs of sun bleaching, and when we open it up I think you'll see why that is when we look at the manual and cartridge. As far as the front cover goes, this is just about as lazy and boring as it gets from a cover art standpoint. The logo is just the title of the game in a basic font, and the background is in plain white, and there's a picture of a soccer ball. I can't imagine why this game might not have sold more copies. Did Accolade think that with the World Cup being right around the corner, all they needed to do was just throw a soccer ball on a cover and Americans would buy it? Don't answer that. The European version is better, actually including a picture of Pele from back in his prime, but they're both a giant step backwards from the cover of the original game, so hopefully that's not a sign of things to come. But it probably is. Flipping over to the rear cover, there's finally a tiny picture of Pele in the middle, and then 4 screenshots that look very reminiscent of the original game. I'll be curious to see how different it looks, if at all. At the top, a decent headline, but what's up with this section here? Now you are part of the world, giant space, tournament. And then down below, having luxury bolded in caps. Why emphasize that? At least at the bottom, there's a list of new features telling you why you should buy this game instead of the original, and you can see where Accolade added in support for EA's 4-way play adapter. Opening up the package, and here's what I was mentioning about the manual and cartridge, and you can see that this was formerly a rental copy with stickers on both. As far as the manual goes, on first glance, this doesn't look like anything special, but once you open it up, it's actually a really detailed manual that goes over all aspects of how to play the game, and even includes a section at the end with some basic details and recommended formations for all the teams, which is very nice. With it being a sports title, I'm sure you could get by without it, but I really appreciate having the control rundowns of exactly which button does what, and if holding down a button is different than just tapping, which isn't always readily apparent. Okay, that's the package. Let's see what Accolade was up to in the 6 months since the first game. So I've got to be honest, I don't really have a whole lot of memories of playing the original Pele. Clearly I played it, and I reviewed it for the channel, but it didn't exactly leave a lasting impression on me. All I really remember offhand is that at first the game was super frustrating because it seemed very difficult to score, but after playing it for a while, I finally figured out sort of a trick, which involved crossing passes to the center. And honestly, that's not necessarily a bad thing because that was actually how I was coached to play soccer in real life. Drive the sides and hit across to the center of the field to possibly catch people out of position. Had I not figured that out, I probably would have given the game a single star instead of 2 stars. There just simply isn't that much there of redeeming value. Enter Pele II this week. As mentioned, Pele II was clearly at least partially a cash grab title to take advantage of the 1994 World Cup. But you can't completely call it a cash grab because it really doesn't share much in common with the original Pele, at least from a game perspective. Due to the fact that both games use an isometric viewpoint, based on the screenshots on the package, I had serious concerns that Pele II was simply a rebadged Pele, but with a few tweaks to market itself to a soccer fanbase that was at an all-time high in the United States at that point. Thankfully, that's not the case, and Pele II is an almost completely revamped experience. Granted, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good experience, but it is most definitely a changed game, and I even booted up the original Pele again just to compare the two as part of my research for the review. The things I do for this channel. Anyway, what's so different? Well, let's start with the game structure. The original Pele was not a game that was aimed at recreating a World Cup experience. It featured 40 teams that were an effort to represent cities from all over the world. But unlike something like European club soccer, which actually tried to replicate popular club teams, they were just teams from random large cities. For instance, New York City was in the game, I guess to give American players a team to play as, but anyone that knows anything about soccer knows that Major League Soccer didn't start play until 2 years after Pele was released, so the only New York soccer team that even made sense was Pele's own New York Cosmos of the NASL, which hadn't existed since 1984. Also, along with the odd fictional team list, the game didn't feature a World Cup-style tournament mode, instead electing for a league configuration instead. Pele II throws all that out and instead features all 24 national teams that competed in the 1994 World Cup. And that probably sounds like a bit of a downgrade, to only include 24 teams instead of 40, but in their defense, the players that make up the rosters are more detailed from a statistical perspective, and the game does include 6 additional teams from countries that didn't quite make the World Cup that year, for instance England and France. It's just that you have to put in a code to use them, and they're only available in exhibition mode. Okay, so now that we've determined what teams are in the game this time around, what can you actually do with them? Well, unfortunately not a whole lot. There's an exhibition mode where you can pick any 2 teams in the game to play against one another, and then there's the tournament mode, which is the unlicensed World Cup mode. And that's it. There's no create your own league, there's no practice or penalty kick mode, it's just exhibition or tournament. Which honestly isn't the biggest deal in the world, but considering one of the biggest problems with the original game was that it was somewhat bare bones, this doesn't do anything to fight off that reputation. However, I don't want to make it seem like there's been no effort expended here, as there are a few additional game options thrown in. The first and probably most visible is the addition of 4-player gameplay. Now, I don't know how often anyone gathered for a 4-player game of Pele II, if it ever happened, but it is here, and like with EA titles, players are free to pick which team they want to play for at the game start screen, so you could theoretically have, say, 3 players versus 1, etc. The game now also has the option to have wet, rainy field conditions, along with the standard dry. I couldn't really tell if playing on a wet field affected gameplay at all, but it at least makes it so that you're not playing on the same boring pitch every single game. Finally, in what is the most useless game option included, there is a 5-on-a-side mode. That probably sounds a bit weird to be playing a soccer match with 5 players instead of the standard 11, and it is. This game mode would make sense if perhaps you had the option of playing indoor soccer, but even then, indoor soccer is traditionally played with 6 on a side, like hockey, so I really don't know what they were thinking here. It's a mode that players will probably play once, maybe for practice, and then will never go back to again. As you might expect, the main focus of the game is the World Cup. Well, I'm sorry, the World Tournament mode, and I can say they did a good job of replicating how the World Cup worked at the time, with countries starting out in groups of 4, and then after group play, the top 16 moving on to a single elimination tournament. Also, there's a nice feature here that you can either play the tournament with groupings that reflect how the 1994 World Cup draw actually unfolded, or if you want some variety, you can set it to random mode and, well, have a random tournament draw. Thankfully, the game includes battery backup to support the tournament mode, which shouldn't be too surprising as the original Pele had battery backup as well, but in the case of Pele II, it allows the game to do a few things you might not be expecting. The first is that with the battery backup, not only is the status of the tournament saved, but your players' stats are saved as well. So if you want to track how your players are doing from a goals, assists, or foul scenario, you can. This was something that I always enjoyed seeing in other franchises, like say NHL hockey, and it wasn't included in the early iterations of the John Madden football series. The other quirk involved with battery backup is how it handles progression in tournament mode, specifically if you lose. In the group round, it saves the group progress, win or lose, as you would expect. However, once you get to the knockout round, if you lose, well, Pele II pretends it didn't happen and doesn't save, giving you an opportunity to replay the last match. I've got mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, it's completely unrealistic, but on the other hand, as an adult with limited time and no real desire to start another tournament over from scratch if I lose, I love it. I don't necessarily think that all games should do this by default, but having it as an option, it's not the worst idea. Of course, none of the game modes really matter if the game itself stinks. So, how does gameplay in Pele II hold up? In a word, If you've played the first Pele, you'll be able to pick up and play Pele II relatively quickly, as the controls are similar. But Pele II isn't just the same game with a fresh coat of paint. It appears to be completely a different game engine. As mentioned, it still utilizes an isometric viewpoint, just like FIFA did at the time, but if you look close, you can tell the angling is slightly different. Beyond that, the players are animated differently as well, with Pele II using its twice as large ROM footprint of now having 16 megabits versus the original's 8, to showcase way more animation in the players and giving the game a much improved look. However, there's just one problem with that. The additional animations in the players, well, they take time to animate on the screen, which causes gameplay to be a bit janky or specifically floaty feeling at times. I had tons of instances where I'd be running to a loose ball with a player, and due to that inaccuracy in the controls, I would run past the ball even though I was first to it, and then the computer would get it instead. As you might expect, especially in a close match, that can get a bit frustrating. The extended animations also cause weirdness in the goalie saves from time to time, with the ball sometimes appearing to teleport into a goalie's hands when they make the save, because the animation doesn't quite line up with where they were on the screen. This isn't as big an issue from the gameplay perspective, but it does look weird. Probably the most important gameplay element, scoring, is improved from the previous game. In the original Pele, it was nearly impossible to score without the use of crossing passes, as straight-on shots would simply never go in or rebound. In Pele II, goalies are still stout, but can make mistakes on occasion, giving the game a much more dynamic feel. It would be nice if the controls were more precise to really take advantage of this improvement, but at least it is an improvement. So I've mentioned the enhanced graphics and how they affected gameplay, but what about the sound? Well, honestly, there's really not a whole lot to discuss when it comes to the sound in Pele II. There's a small amount of decent music that's played in the various selection screens, but as soon as gameplay starts, that's all replaced by crowd noise in the stadium. And I've got to be honest, it's not even good crowd noise. If you were expecting some of the chants or songs that make the international soccer experience what it is, well, you're not going to get that here. Instead, it's really just a low murmur most of the time unless there's a shot on goal. The sound effects used during gameplay are fine, but they're also very few and far between, and you'd be forgiven for not even taking note of them at all. Playing Pele II this week was clearly a much more enjoyable experience over the first game. It's a better game, no question. But that doesn't necessarily make it a good game, as even though I ended up giving the original Pele 2 stars, it probably only deserved 1.5, and if I hadn't figured out the trick to scoring, I definitely wouldn't have rounded up. The problem is, even with Pele 2's improvements, it still feels unpolished in places, especially with the floaty control scheme, and the very simple approach to throw-ins and free kicks. I think had Radical Entertainment had another few months or so to work on the game, some of those things might have been cleaned up, but as is, it's simply the "we have McDonald's at home" answer to other games like FIFA or Sensible Soccer. As a result, I'm giving Pele 2 2 stars. If you have the choice, definitely play this over the original Pele, but honestly, you probably shouldn't bother with either. And that's it for Pele II for the Genesis. If I can say one good thing about Pele II, it's that it was better than I was expecting. There's some nice touches here, like the stadium summaries at the beginning of games that reflect where the games took place in real life for the 1994 World Cup, or the players' mouths moving after scoring goals, like they're screaming with excitement. But ultimately, those small details aren't enough to make up for wonky controls and relatively poor audio. It certainly could have been worse though. Next time on the channel, I think it's time to finally start on a series that ultimately I'll be reviewing 5 games from when all is said and done on the channel, with this next entry on the Master System and then 4 others on the Genesis. Growing up, this was my favorite series of arcade games until I discovered Final Fight, so I'm very excited to take a look and see how the Master System version turned out, especially as compared to the somewhat infamous NES version that I'm not even sure you can necessarily call a port. I'm curious to see if I can score 50,000 points on this one, but I'm not holding my breath. Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 282. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help other people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.